Millionaire CEO walks out of hospital, spots a young girl driving. What he discovered will shock you. Richard Hayes stepped out of the sliding glass doors of St. Mary's Hospital, his polished shoes clicking softly against the wet pavement. The air outside was sharp and cool, brushing against his skin with a freedom he had not felt in days. For a moment he stood still, tightening his coat around his shoulders and drawing in a long breath. The air felt different here, fresher, raw, almost alive, so unlike the stale, sterile corridors he had just left behind. Behind him, the towering building of glass and concrete glowed faintly under the streetlights, every lit window holding a story of pain, of waiting, of fragile hope. He had been told it was only a minor surgery. Nothing to worry about, the doctors said. Yet lying in that narrow hospital bed, with machines beeping faintly and shadows moving past his door, nothing had felt minor at all. He had seen nurses rushing down hallways with tired determination, doctors speaking in hushed but urgent tones, and families clinging to one another in waiting rooms with prayers in their eyes. For once in his life, Richard had been powerless. No deal, no signature, no empire of wealth could ease the sharp ache in his side or shorten the endless hours of recovery. In those white walls, he was not the man who built towers across the city. He was just another patient in a gown. As he began to walk, he noticed how heavy each step felt. The pavement beneath him was slick from a light rain, reflecting the city's glow like a broken mirror. He slowed deliberately, unwilling to rush. The simple act of moving freely, without IV stands, without nurses checking his vitals, felt almost sacred. His reflection in a puddle startled him. The face staring back did not look like the polished CEO from magazine covers or boardrooms. His hair was unkempt, his eyes sunken with shadows, and there was an unfamiliar fragility in his expression. He looked older, weaker, human. Memories of the people he had seen inside the hospital lingered with him. A boy in a wheelchair who smiled despite his frailty. An old woman whispering prayers under her breath. A father pacing outside an operating room, his hands trembling as though holding on to hope itself. Richard had watched them, silently, and for the first time in years he felt stripped of all the shields his wealth had given him. Inside those walls, everyone was equal. The billionaire and the beggar wore the same thin gowns, waiting for the same verdict from a doctor. That humbling truth had carved itself deep into his mind. The city around him carried on, as though nothing had changed. Cars honked, laughter spilled from a group of young people walking past, and the neon signs of shops blinked in the distance. To them, this was just another evening. But for Richard, the world had shifted. He thought of his empire, the shining towers, the endless meetings, the deals that had once consumed every waking thought. Tonight, those things felt distant, almost meaningless. For the first time, he measured his life not in profits, but in heartbeats. His driver had been waiting nearby, sending polite reminders through text, but Richard ignored them. He didn't want the comfort of his luxury car just yet. He wanted the cold air, the damp pavement, the feeling of being alive outside hospital walls. He pulled his scarf tighter and turned once more to look at the building behind him. Each glowing window seemed to whisper stories of struggle, some victories, some defeats, some battles still being fought. He shivered, but not from the cold. It was the weight of knowing he had stood on that edge himself, uncertain and fragile, no different from the rest. He let out a slow breath, his chest rising and followed sound, sung with deliberate control. For years his life had been a race, a constant pursuit of more. Tonight it was different. Tonight he had been forced to slow down, to see life from the perspective of those who carried no wealth, no power, yet faced the same fragility of existence. His discharge from the hospital was not just a release from medical care, it was something more, a warning, a reminder, perhaps even a beginning he couldn't yet define. Richard turned from the hospital one final time and began to walk across the parking lot, the sound of his footsteps echoing faintly in the night air. The lot was dimly lit, most cars already gone, leaving behind rows of silent, metallic shadows. He kept his pace steady, his thoughts still lingering on the weight of what he had just experienced inside. The city lights flickered in the distance, but here, in the stillness of the hospital's edge, everything felt hushed, as though the world itself was pausing to listen. Then, out of the corner of his eye, something unusual caught his attention. Parked a few rows away was a car that seemed entirely out of place. It was old, rusted and worn, its paint peeling in patches like tired skin. Unlike the polished sedans and sleek SUVs that usually filled this lot, this vehicle looked forgotten, abandoned even. Yet as Richard's gaze sharpened, he realized it was not empty. There, in the driver's seat, sat a little girl. She could not have been older than 10. Her tiny frame barely reached over the wheel, her chin just high enough for her to peer out the windshield. Both of her small hands clung to the steering wheel with a desperate grip, knuckles white from the strain. Her face was pale, too pale for a child, and her wide eyes glimmered under the weak glow of the street lamp. Richard slowed, almost stopping mid-step. His first thought was absurd. Perhaps it was a prank, a trick staged by mischievous children. But the look on her face told another story. It was not the look of laughter, not mischief or play. It was as fear, pure, trembling fear. Her lips quivered as though she had been holding back tears for far too long, and her small shoulders shook ever so slightly as she pressed herself against the seat. He blinked, unsure for a moment if exhaustion was making him see things that weren't there. But when he stepped closer, his heart froze. The girl was trembling. Her whole body seemed caught between wanting to move and being paralyzed by terror. She glanced around nervously, her eyes darting toward the hospital entrance, then back to the wheel, then forward again, as though she were waiting for someone, or something, to happen. Richard's instincts sharpened. This was no prank. This was no game. Children did not sit in cars alone at night with expressions like that. His chest tightened as he took another slow step forward, careful not to startle her. He noticed how her small feet dangled above the pedals, barely touching them, as though she had climbed into the seat with a purpose she wasn't ready to fulfill. The cracked windshield reflected her frightened face back at her, and in that reflection, Richard saw something that unsettled him deeply: helplessness. The lot was quiet, except for the faint buzz of a flickering lamp overhead. The girl's tiny figure looked even smaller against the backdrop of the worn car. Her hair fell messily across her forehead, strands sticking to cheeks damp with sweat. She was breathing quickly, shallowly, her chest rising and falling in short bursts. Richard realized she must have been sitting there for some time, wrestling with something far heavier than her young age should have ever carried. His mind began to race with questions. Why was she here? Where was her family? Why was a child sitting alone behind the wheel of a rusted car in a hospital parking lot? And most of all, why did her eyes hold such a desperate, frightened light? He glanced around quickly, scanning the shadows of the lot, half expecting someone to emerge. But there was no one, just the girl, the car, and the quiet tension that hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. Richard swallowed hard, the unease curling in his stomach. Something inside him, something deeper than logic, deeper than caution, told him he could not just walk away. The image of that trembling child rooted him to the ground. The CEO who once thought he could measure life in contracts and numbers now stood frozen, watching a little girl cling to a steering wheel as though it were the only thing keeping her world from falling apart. For the first time that night, Richard felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. Richard's feet moved before his thoughts could catch up, urgency pulling him toward the rusted car. The child inside noticed him approaching, her frightened eyes widening with a mix of hope and dread. For a moment she seemed ready to shrink back, as though expecting trouble. But then her lips parted and a shaky whisper escaped. Her voice was so soft that Richard almost missed it, yet the words pierced through the night. "I don't know what to do. My mum's not waking up." The sound of her trembling voice hit him like a stone to the chest. Richard's pulse quickened as he reached the car, leaning down to peer through the smudged window. What he saw made his breath catch. In the passenger seat lay a woman, her body slumped awkwardly against the door, her face pale and motionless. Her chest rose and fell shallowly, each breath weak and fragile. She looked as though every ounce of strength had been drained from her. Richard's hand immediately pressed against the door handle, his instinct to help overriding everything else. He glanced at the girl again. Her small fingers still clutched the steering wheel as though afraid to let go, her cheeks streaked with tears she had tried to hold back. Her eyes, wide and wet, carried something he had rarely seen before, desperation so raw it made his throat tighten. She wasn't trying to play pretend, wasn't pretending to be strong. She was clinging to survival. Carefully, he opened the car door, the hinges creaking in protest. The girl flinched but didn't move away. Richard crouched slightly so his eyes were level with hers. "It's okay," he said softly, his voice steadier than he felt. "I'm here to help." She blinked, a tear sliding down her cheek, and finally released her grip on the wheel. Her tiny hands dropped into her lap, limp with exhaustion. Turning quickly, Richard leaned toward the woman. He called out to her, but there was no response. He touched her arm gently, hoping for movement, but her head lolled slightly to the side. The shallow breaths continued, uneven and fragile. Relief washed over him that she was at least alive, but the sight filled him with an urgency he hadn't felt in years. Behind him, the girl's quiet sobs grew heavier. "I tried shaking her. I tried calling her name. She just won't wake up," she stammered between gasps, each word broken by panic. Richard's chest tightened at the sound. This child had sat alone in the car with her unconscious mother, clinging to the steering wheel as though it could keep the world from collapsing around her. He could hardly imagine the terror she must have felt. He steadied himself, forcing calm into his voice. "Listen to me," he said, glancing back at the girl. "You did the right thing. You stayed with her. Now let me take care of the rest." Her watery eyes locked onto his, searching for something to believe in. For the first time since he had seen her, she gave the faintest nod, as though surrendering the unbearable weight she had been holding. Richard's mind raced. The hospital was only steps away. He had just walked out of its doors minutes before. Help was right there. Yet at that moment, standing in front of the trembling child and her unconscious mother, the building behind him felt like a lifeline he had no choice but to seize. He glanced back at the woman, her face bathed in the faint orange glow of the streetlight. Her skin was pale, her lips slightly parted, her breaths fragile. Something inside him shifted, an ache, a memory, something he couldn't name. All he knew was that leaving her like this was not an option. The girl tugged gently at his sleeve, her hand small and trembling. "Please, don't let her die." The words broke him in ways he hadn't expected. In boardrooms, he had heard pleas of another kind. Executives begging for deals, businessmen pleading for mercy in negotiations. But this was different. This was not a plea for wealth, for power, or for gain. This was the raw, unfiltered cry of a child begging for her mother's life. For the first time that night, Richard felt his carefully built world shift beneath him. He was not a CEO in this moment, not a man of wealth or power. He was simply a human being, standing in front of a child who had nowhere else to turn. And as her tear-filled eyes clung to him, silently begging for help, he realized there was only one thing left to do. He could not walk away. He would not walk away. Richard didn't waste another moment. He pulled open the door fully and reached for the unconscious woman, his movements careful but urgent. The girl scrambled out of the driver's seat, her little hands instinctively trying to help though her strength was hardly enough. Together they shifted the woman's limp body from the seat, her head rolling weakly against Richard's chest as he gathered her in his arms. The girl clutched her mother's hand the entire time, refusing to let go even as tears streamed down her cheeks. The weight in Richard's arms was more than just physical. It was the crushing awareness that this woman's life was hanging in the balance. He had felt fragile himself only hours earlier, but this was different. This was immediate. This was dire, and the fear etched on the child's face drove him forward with urgency he hadn't known in years. "Hold on to me," he urged the girl, and without hesitation she grabbed his sleeve, her small legs rushing to keep up with his longer strides. The hospital entrance, which moments ago had represented escape and relief, now became the only beacon of hope in sight. Richard's shoes pounded against the pavement as he crossed the lot, his breath quickening not from pain, but from the sheer urgency of the moment. As he burst back through the glass doors, the receptionists and nurses looked up in surprise. "We need help!" Richard's commanding voice cut through the sterile air, carrying with it the sharp edge of desperation. Immediately, medical staff rushed forward, wheeling a gurney toward them. Richard lowered the woman onto it with as much care as he could manage, stepping back only when steady hands took over. The girl refused to let go of her mother's hand, even as the gurney began to roll toward the emergency wing. She stumbled slightly, but Richard caught her just in time, steadying her with a firm grip. Her tiny hand reached for his in panic, and without hesitation he let her hold on. Her fingers were icy, trembling with fear, but she clung to him as if he were the only anchor left in her storm. They followed the rush of doctors and nurses down the bright hallway. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly above, illuminating the pale figure on the gurney as medical staff checked her vitals, pressed stethoscopes against her chest, and called out instructions. The urgency in their voices was sharp, each word cutting into the silence of Richard's thoughts. He glanced down at the girl walking beside him, her wide eyes locked onto her mother's still face. Her lips trembled with words she couldn't bring herself to say. Richard squeezed her hand gently, silently promising her he would not let her face this alone. In that moment, the world of business and power seemed laughably small. This was not about deals or wealth. This was about life, about the bond between a child and the only family she had. When the gurney finally disappeared through swinging double doors, Richard and the girl were stopped by a nurse. "Please wait here," she said, her tone firm but kind. The girl's hand tightened around his, her body shaking as though the ground beneath her might collapse. Richard knelt so that his eyes were level with hers. "She's in good hands," he whispered, his voice softer now, stripped of all the commanding edge it usually carried. "They'll do everything they can for her." The girl's lip quivered. "Promise," she whispered, her voice breaking under the weight of her fear. Richard felt his throat tighten, but he nodded firmly. "I promise." The promise wasn't business. It wasn't numbers or guarantees. It was raw, uncalculated, and deeply human. And as the girl leaned against him, clutching his hand with all her strength, Richard realized he wasn't just a bystander anymore. He had stepped into her story, and there was no stepping back. For the first time in years, he felt a pain that had nothing to do with profit or loss. The aching, unshakable weight of a child, desperate to save her only family. The waiting hours dragged on, each second feeling like an eternity. Richard remained seated in the quiet corner of the hospital lounge, the little girl still close beside him. She had refused to let go of his arm, her small body leaning against him as though she needed his presence to keep herself from breaking apart. Her eyes, swollen from crying, darted nervously toward the hallway every time a doctor or nurse passed by, hoping for news that would ease her fears. When at last a doctor emerged, his expression softened by relief, Richard felt the girl's grip tighten once more. "She's stable," the doctor said gently. "Exhaustion led to a collapse, but she's going to make it. With rest and proper care, she'll recover." Those words felt like a lifeline. The little girl released a trembling breath, her shoulders finally sagging under the weight of relief. She buried her face in her hands, sobbing not out of fear, but out of overwhelming release. Richard placed a hand on her back, rubbing it lightly, unsure how else to comfort her. He had no children of his own, but in that moment he acted as though he had always known how to console a child. Slowly, her tears subsided, and she lifted her head, her cheeks flushed and eyes red, but determined to speak. "My name's Sophie," she whispered, her voice quiet but steady. It was the first time she had spoken her name aloud since the chaos began, and Richard felt a strange weight lift simply by knowing it. "Sophie," he repeated gently, as if committing it to memory. "That's a beautiful name." Sophie nodded, brushing her tears with the back of her sleeve. She glanced toward the door where her mother lay recovering, then lowered her gaze, fidgeting with the hem of her worn dress. "Mom works a lot," she murmured, the words spilling out in fragments as if they had been locked away for too long. "2 jobs, sometimes 3. She says it's the only way we can eat, the only way we can stay in our apartment." Richard listened quietly, leaning slightly forward so she would know he was giving her his full attention. She looked up, her eyes shimmering with a mixture of pride and sadness. "She never stops working. I wait in the car a lot while she runs inside places, stores, offices, sometimes restaurants. She doesn't like leaving me alone at home because it's not safe. So I sit and wait, and sometimes I fall asleep in the back seat." Her voice broke, but she steadied herself quickly. "Today she came back to the car, but she fell. She couldn't wake up. I thought if I could drive, maybe I could find someone to help, but I didn't know how. I was so scared." The raw honesty in her confession pierced Richard's heart. He could see her knuckles tighten as she spoke, her tiny fingers curling into fists, as though she still felt the panic of those moments in the driver's seat. He reached out, gently unclenching her fist with his larger hand. "You did exactly what you could, Sophie," he told her firmly, his voice low but steady. "You stayed with her. You tried. And because of you, she's still here." Sophie's eyes filled again, though this time they weren't just from fear. They were from the fragile relief of being believed, of having someone acknowledge her effort. She wiped her face again, nodding faintly. "I didn't know what else to do," she whispered. Richard leaned back, his mind spinning not with business calculations but with memories he had buried beneath years of wealth and success. He saw his own mother in Sophie's words, the endless hours she had worked in small shops and cleaning houses, the nights she came home too exhausted to even eat. He remembered sitting on old wooden steps waiting for her return, his small stomach aching from hunger, his young heart aching even more from worry. For the first time in years, those memories rose to the surface, raw and painful. He had built an empire to escape them, yet here they were, alive in the story of a little girl who could have been him decades ago. His chest tightened as he realized he wasn't just listening to Sophie. He was listening to a reflection of his past. Sophie looked at him curiously, sensing the heaviness in his silence. "Did you ever feel like this?" she asked softly, as though unsure if she was allowed to ask. Richard's lips curved into the faintest bittersweet smile. "Yes," he admitted quietly, his eyes fixed on the floor before meeting hers again. "More than you know." Her small head tilted, her eyes widening slightly. She didn't press for details, but her expression told him she understood enough, that even someone like him, a man who carried himself with confidence and wealth, had once known what it was to be small and afraid, to wonder if tomorrow would be kinder. In that fragile silence, Richard realized the truth. Fate had placed Sophie in his path not by accident, but as a reminder of where he had come from, and perhaps a sign of where he was meant to go next. The steady rhythm of the heart monitor was the first sound Sophie's mother heard as her eyes fluttered open. Confusion clouded her face, but when her gaze found her daughter sitting beside the bed, clutching her hand as though it were the only anchor in the world, tears welled up instantly. Sophie leaned forward, burying her face against her mother's arm, her small body shaking with relief. "Mom," she whispered, her voice breaking with the weight of everything she had carried alone that day. Her mother lifted a trembling hand to stroke Sophie's hair, guilt pressing heavily into her expression. "I'm so sorry, baby," she murmured, her voice hoarse. "I didn't mean to scare you. I should have been stronger." But Sophie shook her head fiercely, tears streaming down her cheeks. "You don't have to be stronger all the time," she said through sobs. "You're already strong. I just didn't know what to do without you." Richard stood quietly at the foot of the bed, watching the exchange with a heaviness in his chest. He had seen countless deals close, watched empires grow, and signed contracts worth millions. Yet none of those moments carried the weight of this one, an exhausted mother, a devoted child, and the fragile bond that neither hardship nor fear could break. When the tears slowed, Richard stepped forward, his deep voice steady but soft. "You don't have to do this alone anymore," he said, his gaze meeting the mother's weary eyes. She blinked at him, confused at first, then deeply wary, as though kindness from a stranger was harder to believe in than her own suffering. "I'm Richard Hayes," he continued, pulling a chair closer to her bedside so he could speak without towering over her. "I've built a life that gave me more than I ever imagined. But somewhere along the way I forgot what really matters. Today, your daughter reminded me, and I can't just walk away." Her lips parted, but words failed her as he went on. "I want to help, not out of pity, not as charity, but because I see in Sophie the same fight I once had. I'll cover her education, every bit of it, and your medical care. No more working yourself to collapse just to make it through another month. You both deserve more than survival. You deserve a chance to live." Silence hung heavy in the room, broken only by the steady beeping of the machine. The mother's eyes filled with fresh tears, though these weren't born of fear or pain. They were tears of disbelief, of hope so sudden it hurt to let it in. She reached out with trembling fingers, gripping his hand as though she were testing if he was real. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you do this for us?" Richard hesitated, searching for words that carried the weight of truth. His voice was low, steady, almost reverent when he finally answered. "Because once, someone should have done it for me. And because your daughter reminded me that strength doesn't always wear a suit. Sometimes it's just a little girl refusing to give up." Sophie looked between them, her wide eyes brimming with awe. She didn't fully understand the magnitude of his promise, but she understood enough to know that their lives had shifted. She reached for Richard's hand, placing her tiny fingers over his, her touch full of unspoken gratitude. From that moment forward, the air in the room seemed lighter. The hospital walls no longer felt like a cage, but like a place where a new story had begun. For years, Richard had been celebrated in magazines, hailed as a visionary, praised as the millionaire CEO who never failed. Yet none of those accolades mattered compared to the title he had just earned in the quiet of that room. To Sophie, he was no longer a stranger. He was the man who listened when no one else could hear her silent plea. The man who showed up when her small world had nearly shattered. To her mother, he was not simply a benefactor, but a guardian who had stepped into their lives when they needed him most. As the evening sun filtered through the blinds, casting a golden glow across the room, Richard felt something shift deep within him. For years he had been running from his past, burying the boy who once knew hunger, fear, and loneliness. But now, as Sophie leaned against him and her mother held onto his hand, he realized that boy had never truly been gone. He had simply been waiting for a reason to come alive again. Leaving the hospital that night, Richard no longer felt like the patient who had walked out just a day earlier. He was changed, not by wealth, not by success, but by a child's desperate courage and a mother's unyielding love. And for the first time in a long time, he felt whole. From that day forward, Richard Hayes wasn't just the CEO admired in glossy magazines or the businessman envied in boardrooms. He became something greater, something deeper, a protector, a giver, a man who finally understood that the greatest wealth he could ever possess was the power to change lives. And for Sophie, the millionaire she had met by chance outside the hospital would never simply be a man of fortune. He would forever be the guardian fate had sent her at the perfect time, the one who proved that even in the darkest moments, miracles could come in the form of a stranger who chose to care.